hello to everybody, wherever you are and which time zone you are in. I hope all of you are fine in all the edges of this world. We have changed a little bit our program. That means we are beginning with Justin now, and later on we'll postpone the talk Ales Bello has given us. So let me just introduce briefly Justin. Justin Arickal was born in Cologne, and after working by a company, decided to study theology at the University of Bonn, where he is now doctoral candidate. Currently at Yale University, Justin is conducting an Individuation research of the perceived ambiguity of God. On this background, he reflects on Stein's theocentrism as it may contribute to rediscover God in ambiguous times. So we are looking forward very much and indeed to sharing your reflections. Justin, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joachim, for the introduction, and thanks to all the organizers for setting up this conference. It is really a delight for me to be part of it today, and hopefully also over the next couple of days. And maybe I start with a personal note, because Edith Stein conferences have a special meaning in my life. As Joachim indicated, I was in the business world before switching to theology. And in 2013, I quit my job and then switched to theology. And one major part in this whole process of discerning my call to theology was attending an Edith Stein conference in Germany in 2012. And I was attending that conference, and there were professors from all over Europe talking about the philosophy and some theological aspects of Edith Stein. And that inspired me so much that I thought I just have to switch gears and switch to theology. So it's great to be here today, and let me just share my screen with you. So I'm currently working on my doctoral dissertation, which is basically trying to develop a synthesis between biblical and systematic theology. So actually, Edith Stein, at the beginning of my dissertation, didn't play a big role. But now I'm working on one chapter where she actually does play a major part. So I'm sharing with you a couple of insights of my research that I conducted over the last couple of months. And as Joachim said, I'm usually at Bonn University in Germany. At the moment, I'm at Yale in the US, but just for a research semester here, but then back in Germany. And the advantage of being in Bonn is you're close to Cologne, where the Edith Stein archive is. So there are a couple of things that we'll be adding over there. So the title of my talk is Encountering God, Edith Stein's Existential Theocentrism as a Contribution to Rediscovering God in Ambiguous Times. So I'm focusing more on her mystical writings, especially the two latest work of her writings. And I just want to go with you through 5 basic steps. The first one is to clarify the terminology that I'm using and contextualizing what I'm talking about. The second point is to have a look on Edith Stein's hermeneutical reference points when it comes to mysticism, because you're probably all familiar with the reference points when it comes to a phenomenological philosophy. But when it comes to mysticism, it's, of course, Teresa of Avila, because she's a Carmelite. But later on, when she really is doing a systematic investigation, it's Dionysius the Areopagite and John of the Cross. So we'll look at those two. And especially when she's reflecting on Dionysius the Areopagite, she's systemizing ways of recognizing and encountering God. In German, it says Wege der Gotteserkenntnis. So we'll have a look at that as well, because she's basically extracting 3 major ways of recognizing and encountering God. And in this process of encountering God, she also refers to the dark night, a phrase or a term from John of the Cross, as a process of spiritual maturing. And I think this is especially important when we are facing ambiguity in our lives, or uncertainty or suffering. And then finally, I want to briefly look at what it all means in her life, because her life is basically like a synthesis of theocentrism in times of ambiguity and suffering. So this is like our little pathway for this session. And let me start with the terminology first. When I talk about existential theocentrism, what I mean by that is a God-centered life in all aspects of human existence. So if you're familiar with the life of Edith Stein, you may think, well, was she really God-centered all her life? Because at the beginning of her life, especially in her teenage years, she had times where she disregarded her faith. She stopped praying and stopped believing in God. Of course, later on as a philosopher, this stream continued. And then there was the conversion, although the term conversion has to be used very carefully with respect to Edith Stein, to Christianity, and then her entering the Carmelite congregation. So later you see explicitly her God-centeredness. But even in the early stages of her life, you can actually qualify her life as a God-centered life. Why is that? There is this famous quote from her, which is often quoted, and it comes from a letter from Edith Stein to Algundes Jägerschmidt, where she says, "God is truth. Whoever seeks the truth is seeking God, whether he realizes it or not." So even in the first phase of Edith Stein's life, where she was maybe not explicitly God-centered or God-seeking, she was truth-seeking, and especially in her first years also as a philosopher. So if she equates God with truth, then she, as a truth seeker in the first part of her life, was also a God seeker. And of course, if we consider Christology and the Johannine Christology, where Jesus in 14:6 says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," we have that equation too, right? So whether Edith Stein was in her first part of life explicitly God-centered or not, I think with this equation, you can still say she was indeed a God-centered person throughout her life, because she was also a truth-centered person. And she lived that in all aspects of the human existence, and more visible to the outer world in the second part of her life. So another major term that I'm using is ambiguous times. And ambiguity refers to a phenomena which is open to multiple interpretations. So one part of ambiguity is it cannot be really defined, because it's in the essence of ambiguity that it cannot be unity or unilaterally be pinpointed. And if we contextualize the time, or put into context when Edith Stein lived, the Nazi time in Germany in the 30s and 40s, especially when she wrote those two mystical works, it was a time of not only ambiguity, but uncertainty, chaos, and suffering. So to live theocentrism in times of ambiguity, uncertainty, and suffering is even more challenging than to live it in times where everything seems to be fairly calm. So I think especially in our contemporary situation, with all the ambiguity that we have, with the plurality that we have, with the relativism that we have, I think Edith Stein has something to tell us, even or especially in times of ambiguity and uncertainty. So when we look at Edith Stein's writings and the development of her writings and the focus of her writings, we see a shift from philosophy to mysticism. So one work that I will be referring to is Wege der Gotteserkenntnis, written in 1941. As far as I know, there is no English translation available so far. But yeah, it's basically a study of Dionysius the Areopagite, a commentary on him, and translation of his works. And she is mostly reflecting on his symbolic theology and his negative theology. So negative theology, if you're not familiar with that term, it's like apophatic theology. It's not an evaluation of theology. It's more understanding the greatness of God and accepting the greatness of God, and because of that realization, to accept that we cannot express him in words or symbols or metaphors, that God is always beyond of what we can recognize and intellectually encompass. So the negative theology is emphasizing the greatness of God, and that's of course, Dionysius the Areopagite is a major forethinker of negative or apophatic theology. The second major work on mysticism of Edith Stein is Kreuzeswissenschaft. And there's an English translation available, The Signs of the Cross of Köppel. And this is a study of John of the Cross and a reflection on the mystical union with God, la union divina, as John of the Cross says. And it also is considering that process of the dark night, that period of existential crisis that people may experience in their faith life. And if you look at both works, you see they have been written in the final 2 years of her life. So this is posing the question if this is kind of a legacy or some kind of if it has a special meaning to it. Because interestingly, Kreuzeswissenschaft was still open on her desk on that day when she was deported by the SS soldiers. So it's actually a work that she worked on during her final years in that Carmelite congregation in Echt. It has been debated in research whether it is completed or not. Ulrich Dopan, who also wrote the introduction of the German version, Kreuzeswissenschaft, he argues that basically the content is completed. There may be some kind of appendix that you probably wanted to add, which are not there, but the general body of work is considered to be completed. And the mainstream of Kreuzeswissenschaft research is tending now to the same direction, that it is basically completed. Now, what makes it a little bit difficult is that mysticism is generally a complex research field. And in terms of Edith Stein, researchers more often focus on her philosophical writings, which makes sense because Stein had a very high philosophical output. So her two mystical writings, they are not so much at the center of Edith Stein research. And in addition to that, the complex issue with mysticism is that research on mysticism tries to capture and reflect on a human experience of the transcendence that is beyond the means of language and cognitive reflection. So if a mystic is having a mystical experience, he has that immediate experience and then reflects on it and then put it into words. So the thing that we have is not the direct experience, it's only a translation of it. So it's difficult to put it in words. And that is, for example, John of the Cross puts his mystical experience in poetry. He conveys it through poetry, or some other mystics in art. So the normal terms and means of language that we have are not really sufficient to grasp and capture that initial experience. That makes it a little bit more challenging. So it's also a constant balancing act between the linguistically expressible and the linguistically inexpressible realm. Yeah. So to write on mystical experience is already a challenge, and then to reflect on what has been written on it is again adding another layer. And an additional aspect is that the two hermeneutical reference points, Dionysius the Areopagite and John of the Cross, date back many centuries ago. So if you look at Dionysius the Areopagite, he's from the 6th century, so the symbolism and the language he used is also a little bit different than what we are used to when it comes to theology or metaphors or symbolism. So that adds another layer. So it's a little bit challenging, but it's worth the effort. Another key issue when dealing with mystical experiences and reflecting on it, is it possible to understand mystical experience without being a mystic myself? That's also a general question. And Edith Stein says it's possible that one can understand the writings and the works of the mystics without being a mystic. Yeah, at least to a certain degree. And in the German original, she says, in der Weise, wie man die Schriften der Mystiker verstehen kann, ohne selbst Mystiker zu sein. So I think that's the good news for everyone who doesn't consider himself to be a mystic. We can still, at least to a certain degree, understand what they are referring to. And it leads us now to the question, what is actually a mystical experience? According to Edith Stein, It's simply being innerly touched by God. Yeah, she calls it das innere berührt werden von Gott. So it's not something spectacular or something, it's not something spectacular or something ecstatic or something visionary. It's simply having that personal encounter with God, being innerly touched by God. So she actually gives us a very grounded understanding of mysticism. And I think that's very important, because if you consider the context of Dionysius the Areopagite, he has some Neoplatonic streams in his thinking and in his writing. And Neoplatonism has then always a tendency for dualism, but Edith Stein actually overcomes that dualism and has a very grounded understanding of mysticism. And you see here also development from Dionysius the Areopagite to John of the Cross, who has also this very grounded understanding of mysticism. It's also a little bit of a difference between John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila. Teresa of Avila also appreciates the ecstatic moments and the visionary elements, whereas John of the Cross says we have to overcome that. You know, we have to overcome the visionary aspects of it to become actually, in German, it says bildlos, without any images. And that's also a process of the dark night to get rid of the images. Again, it's not a spectacular event. But at the same time, Edith Stein points out that there are various steps and degrees of mystical experience of God. Yeah, in German, she says, verschiedene Stufen und Übergänge. So we cannot just say it's just one kind of experience. There are different kinds and varieties of experiences. But she also says the higher the degree, the greater is the self-revelation of God to the human soul, and the greater is the intimate encounter of the human soul with God. What I want to point out here is she is using the term self-revelation of God, in German Selbstoffenbarung Gottes, which is a term, she's using that in 1941. This is a term that actually was established in theology only after Second Vatican Council in 1960s. It was in the dogmatic constitution of the Revelation De Verbum, where this term has been explicitly unfolded. So if we look at these writings of Edith Stein, we can see that she is, when it comes to understanding of revelation, ahead of her time, you know, at least 20 years ahead of her time, because she's understanding revelation as the self-revelation of God. So God is not revealing certain sentences or certain instructions or certain contents of beliefs. He is revealing himself. And in the most intimate way, he is self-revealing himself to the human soul, enabling this intimate encounter. So if you look at this and contextualize with systematic theology, you see that she was indeed ahead of her time. And these type of encounters with God are characterized by I cannot see the full slide here, by immediacy and directness. She says in German, Charakter der Unmittelbarkeit. But again, as I said, it's not necessarily something visionary or spectacular. Again, here she is also, again, ahead of her time, because in the first half of the 20th century, mysticism was still understood as something which is related to ecstatic experiences. At least in the mainstream, and she's breaking that up with her works. So when we look at her way of systemizing ways of encountering God, we can see that she has three ways. The first way is the way of reason. Of course, she as a philosopher has a high regard for reason, and she points out there's a natural understanding of God through the natural world. She calls it natürliche Gotteserkenntnis. Again, this is something where she's actually adding something to Dionysius the Areopagite, because he doesn't appreciate that natural understanding of God through the world as much as she does. So she's adding a layer here. So obviously through reason you can encounter God and get closer to God, and also through the symbols and things that you see in creation. There are always reference points to the Creator. A second way is the way of faith. And here she points out encountering God through believing Holy Scripture and the testimonies of homo religiosi in Scripture. And it's interesting to me, with her Jewish background, she has a lot of reference points to the Old Testament, or the First Testament, as Erich Zenger would say. So she's taking also those testimonies of those centuries and millennia of homo religiosi together and says, we have here testimonies, and if we believe those testimonies, we will have a similar experience. And through this way of believing those testimonies, we will also encounter God. And the third way, she says, is the way of personal experience. So encountering God through personal or mystical experience. Yeah, and I will get to that in a second. So these three ways, they are like also can be seen as simultaneously, partially. It's not a sequential order. It can happen like simultaneously. And the main thing that you can see in this development is that the intimacy grows. But it doesn't mean that one way is better than the other. It just means one way is more intimate than the other. So what are then the essential preconditions for encountering God in the mystical sense? So first of all, she says mystical experiences are graces given by God. So it's not something that we can produce. However, there are some preconditions that can be identified. And the first one is to have a devotion and openness to God, and entrusting oneself to God and letting go of self-made images of God. And this is something that gets purified, as he says, a Reinigungsprozess through the dark night. A process of spiritual maturing in times of suffering. And John of the Cross says that there are basically three stages of the dark night, and Edith Stein adopts the same concept. The first phase is the night of the senses, Nacht der Sinnenbereiche. It's an experience where maybe certain spiritual exercises that gave some peace of mind or some joy, they seem to be dull and boring and not fulfilling anymore. Spiritual practices that used to make sense seem to be meaningless. And there's also another phase, the night of the Spirit. So maybe there was some consolation of the Holy Spirit during times of spiritual practices. And then this human soul experienced some kind of hiddenness of God, that God is far away or something is missing or lacking. And this is really a painful process, an existential crisis of a human being. And in recent years, there have been made some studies between dark night, as described as John of the Cross as a spiritual process, and clinical depression. And the interesting thing is that often symptoms are similar, so it cannot be really differentiated. But the interesting thing is that John of the Cross shows ways how to spiritually make sense of this phase, and to see like spiritual fruits growing out of that phase. So I think it still remains a major aspect in today's research, and his creative way of dealing with it. And at the end of this process, there's the dawn, the Morgendämmerung. It's similar, she compares it in Signs of the Cross with, of course, the suffering and death of Christ and the time of resurrection. So that there is this light of the morning, the morning star that is rising, the Morgenstern. So this whole process of the dark night actually can lead to this experience of resurrection and experience of God's light. So the dark night can result in a healthy detachment from the worries of the world, so that the human soul becomes more open to God. And it also helps to let go of self-made images and expectations of God. And by doing so, an inner space will open up within the human soul in which God can actually reveal himself as he really is, and therefore lead the human soul to a more intimate union with him. It goes back to that notion of self-revelation. If I seek a relationship with God because of the effects, for example, I want the effect of peace or joy or calmness, then I'm not seeking God for his own sake, I'm seeking God for his fruits. And in this process, John of the Cross and Edith Stein go so far to say, no, it's not about the joy or not about the peace or not about the calmness. There may be side effects of my relationship with God, but I'm seeking God for his own sake. And that's obviously a very mature stage of spiritual life. So I hurry up with the last few slides. If we look at today's time, one of the most influential theologians of the 20th century, Karl Rahner, said the Christian of the future will be a mystic or will not exist at all. So mysticism is not an elite spiritual endeavor, but at the heart of an intimate relationship between God and the human soul. And I think Edith Stein helps us to get to that point too. And without that mystical dimension, an essential integral part of Christian life is being missed. Yeah, because again, it's about the self-revelation of God and having that that intimate relationship with him. And Edith Stein's two latest works focus on this indispensable part. It's also interesting to me, from a theological perspective, that she points out that the goal of theology is to clear the way to God so that the human soul can encounter God as he is. And the German originalist, she says, im Grunde ist dies das Ziel aller Theologie, den Weg zu Gott selbst freimachen. And I think that's also kind of a legacy also for theologians of today or theologians of the future. As much as we can discuss about specific concepts and different ways of doing theology, I think Edith Stein's way of defining the goal of theology is absolutely crucial. So what we can see, everybody who's familiar with Edith Stein knows that Edith Stein's mystical work are also characterized by constant search for truth, a strong theocentrism, and an extraordinary tolerance for ambiguity. And you can see that in her whole life's journey. You can see it in the intellectual journey, search for truth and the truth-seeking aspect. You can see it in her spiritual life, the theocentrism, but you can also see that she maintains that even in times of ambiguity and suffering. So it's not only that she has intellectually grasped, I think, mysticism, but that she actually lived it throughout her life, especially also in the last days in Auschwitz. We have testimonies of different people who have been liberated afterwards, and we have testimony that even in those dark times, she was still consoling others and still lived that theocentrism in an absolutely horrific environment. And that's something I think that we can still learn from, and that is rooted in her intimacy with God, which I think is still a role model for us. So with that, it was a quick run through some aspects of her understanding of mysticism. Thank you, and I'm open for any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Justin. I promised an interview and research, and I heard one, so I'm really totally grateful for what you said to us. There's actually two questions. One is coming up from a participant. What do you think about the end of Kreuzeswissenschaft? Was it finished when she was then taken to Auschwitz? What do you think?
It's a tricky question. I would tend to say that her main line of thought is finished in that work. I think there's not a major part missing. If I compare it with John of the Cross, he has several writings, right? So when she stops her Kreuzeswissenschaft, she has already that dawn, that Morgendämmerung, that mystical union already described, but you can still feel the heaviness of the previous chapters. And I think it relates to the specific circumstances. She has been going through this time of persecution, of that political situation in Germany is getting worse and worse. And I think that feeling of the cross also on her shoulders got heavier and heavier. And I think you can sense that when reading that too.
Yes.
I would, of course, love to read a bigger happy end or bigger chapter on the resurrection or bigger chapter on the beautiful fruits of mystical union, but it's not part of that, not as much. So, yeah, although I would miss it a little bit, I think her main line of thought, I think, is completed there. So I would agree with Ulrich Dopan that the body of work is in its essence finished. Yeah.
Yeah. And perhaps one very last question, and going back about 20 years in her life to the beginning of the 1920s, because when you are talking about ambiguity, for me as a theologian, immediately, and a philosopher, always immediately comes to mind Rudolf Otto, the Holy, the Heilige. Mm-hmm. And we have indications that Schorr-Hering and others around Edith Stein were intensely busy with Rudolf Otto. They even had personal contacts. I don't know whether you happen to that, but do you think the ambiguity which Rudolf Otto describes between the fascinans and the tremendum is a kind of parallel to what she experienced?
Yes. On the one hand, I see similarities and parallels. And at the same time, when I read her own autobiography, aus dem Leben einer jüdischen Familie, out of the life of a Jewish family, I feel that that topic of ambiguity and kind of suffering has been like a ongoing theme in her life, with the early death of her father, with the death of a couple of siblings, with the high sensitivity as a young girl. Yes, on the one hand, there is this positive connotation to ambiguity, but also that negative connotation of ambiguity, where she had to deal with a lot of challenging things in her life and being intellectually like super smart in her class, but at the same time being a little bit like reserved. And so if you read her autobiography, you see like this dealing with ambiguity is like a constant theme. That makes her obviously a fascinating person, because she somehow made that fruitful and productive for her life and for her thinking.
So thank you very much. So, well, we don't know whether Oxford was finished or not, but we know that you are still on your way, and we are looking forward to get then your answers finished in some months or years. Thank you very much for that. Have a good day then, Justin. Thank you. Next, we are kind of privileged now to hear Rubén Sánchez Muñoz. I hope he is here. Yeah, he's still mute. Here we are. Hi, Rubén. Buenos días. This is everything I can say in Spanish. Sorry for that.
Buenos días.
I'd like to, okay, muy bien. Okay. Anyway, I'd like to introduce you briefly. You are working as research professor at Puebla, the so-called, as I know, Rome of Mexico, at the University Popular Autónoma del Estado. And together with other Mexican friends and members of JASPIS, he has been amazingly organizing in the most brilliant way this conference behind the stage. And now he's going to present on stage. So, Rubén, we are excited to hear you talk about the religious phenomenon in Edith Stein. Over to you.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días, buenas tardes a todos. Me siento muy contento de poder participar en la organización de este congreso y de poder participar al mismo tiempo con este trabajo. A pesar de que hace tiempo que estudio la obra de Edith Stein, esta es la primera vez que participo en el congreso de JASPIS y eso me pone muy contento. En la ponencia que les voy a leer hablaré del fenómeno religioso, entre otras razones, porque en este mismo año se cumplen 100 años de la conversión de Edith Stein y porque posiblemente las investigaciones filosóficas sobre este tema en nuestra autora son menores respecto del tratamiento propiamente religioso del mismo tema. Así que voy a presentar el trabajo en español, no in English. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I am very happy to be able to take part in organization of this Congress and to be able to take part in this work at the same time. Also, I've been studying Edith Stein work for a long time. This is first time I participate in the Congress IASPES. In detail, I'm going to read to you, I talk about the religious phenomenon among other reasons, because this year marks the 100th anniversary of the conversion of Edith Stein, and because possible the philosophical research on the subject in our author are less than the strictly religious treatment of the same subjects. I will present the word in Spanish and start. La experiencia religiosa en Edith Stein respecto de la vivencia de Dios. Voy a presentar también, presentar los puntos más importantes de esta ponencia. Edith Stein recurre a dos expresiones que nos permiten comprender el fenómeno religioso en sus obras y en su propia vida. Uno de ellos se refiere al descanso en Dios y el otro describe la vivencia de cobijo. Lo que Stein llama vivencia de cobijo, Geborgenheit, deja ver la influencia que las notas de Adolf Reibnach tuvieron en sus propias investigaciones, pero cabe decir que Edith Stein hace suya esa expresión para referirse al fenómeno religioso en varias de sus obras. Antes de avanzar, es preciso decir algunas cosas. En lugar de hablar de experiencia religiosa, así de manera individual, Edith Stein habla de experiencias religiosas. El 20 de noviembre de 1927 le escribió una carta a Romanin Garden en la que aparece esta indicación, dando a entender precisamente que la relación con Dios puede darse de diferentes maneras. Sin que el encuentro con Dios sea a través de una contemplación directa de su persona, sí que hay modos de acercarse a Él. Stein escribió: creo que se puede y debe hablar de experiencias religiosas, pero con ello no se trata de una contemplación directa de Dios. El camino normal discurre sobre efectos que uno nota en sí, en otros y en los acontecimientos, en la naturaleza y en la vida de los hombres, de los cuales ninguno tomado en sí mismo remite tan claramente a la autoridad divina, de modo que ya no fuera pensable otra explicación. Sin embargo, todos ellos contienen en sí una tal indicación. Alguno es tan fuerte en su aislamiento que es imposible rehuirla. En todo caso, su impacto es tal que metodológicamente uno puede dudar, pero no realmente. No es necesario que al final de nuestra vida lleguemos a una prueba convincente de la experiencia religiosa, pero sí es necesario que tomemos una decisión a favor o contra Dios. Esto es lo que nos exige, decidirnos sin una prueba de garantía. Este es el gran desafío de la fe. Aún así, lo que puede decirse es que, por un lado, tenemos las experiencias religiosas en sus diversas manifestaciones y, por otro lado, aparece o se da la toma de posición del sujeto que es afectado por dichas vivencias. Que se den dichas vivencias no es suficiente para que la toma de posición sea a favor de ella. Cabe la posibilidad que el sujeto de la vivencia religiosa rechace lo que en ella aparece, puede negarla e incluso pasarla por alto. Por ello, Stein juzga que el desafío de la fe consiste en decidirse a favor o contra de lo dado en la vivencia religiosa sin tener una prueba de garantía. Ahora bien, de acuerdo con estas indicaciones, las experiencias religiosas pueden aparecer en uno mismo al modo de experiencias originarias vividas en primera persona, o bien pueden darse en los otros y uno mismo empatizar con ellas. Que estos efectos puedan aparecer también en los acontecimientos del mundo puede querer indicar, siguiendo la línea de un argumento cosmológico, que Dios se manifiesta en su creación, digamos, por poner un caso, en la belleza que hay en el mundo, en las buenas acciones, en las obras de amor, etc. Lo que dice Stein, en consecuencia, es que aún en estos casos se puede dudar metodológicamente, pero no realmente. ¿Por qué no se puede dudar realmente? Lo que ocurre aquí es que, así como la vivencia religiosa escapa al dominio de la voluntad, esto no es un acto del querer porque el sujeto no la produce, sino que más bien la vivencia y es afectado por ella. Del mismo modo, el sujeto de la vivencia religiosa no elimina o borra dicha vivencia como tal y su contenido cuando duda de lo que ha mostrado. Por ejemplo, dice Beate Beckmann-Seller, en último término, solo se puede pretender la vivencia religiosa, no hacerla venir de modo efectivo, ya que en este caso la voluntad no puede provocarla, de tal manera que, yendo más allá de la terminología de Stein, se puede hablar aquí de un acto de esperar. En consecuencia, la persona podría desear vivir la experiencia religiosa sin que llegue a dársele. Y las palabras de Stein, yo puedo anhelar para mí una fe religiosa, puedo esforzarme por ella con todas mis energías y puede ser que esa fe no se me conceda. Puedo profundizar en la grandeza de un carácter, pero sin poder tributarle la admiración que se merece. Justo porque la fe exige decidirse sin una prueba de garantía, la fe, en palabras de Stein, es el acto religioso fundamental. Digamos entonces que Stein había descubierto el mundo de la fe, pero como cuenta ella misma, todavía no daba su consentimiento. Para saber un poco más de ello, veremos más adelante qué lugar ocupan las tomas de posición. Que algo aparezca todavía no es suficiente para decidirse a favor de ello. Esto es un aspecto importante que va a resaltar después en una carta de 1927 a Romanin Garden. Las experiencias religiosas pueden presentarse de distintas formas, pero ello no asegura que el sujeto que es afectado por dichas vivencias se decante a favor de lo que en ellas se muestra. Este sujeto puede también oponer resistencia y no aceptar lo que en estas experiencias le es dado. Como dice Francisco Javier Sancho Fermín, el Dios ante el cual Stein se encontraba al momento de su conversión era precisamente fuente de esperanza para los suyos y al mismo tiempo era un Dios cercano y presente al que se podía hablar en cualquier momento. Y ello le atrajo de un modo especial porque después de abrirse al encuentro de estas vivencias, todavía Edith Stein tenía que decidirse si tenía que profesar un cristianismo protestante o un cristianismo de la Iglesia Católica, y tenía testimonios de sus amigos precisamente en estas posibilidades. Husserl era judío bautizado en la Iglesia Luterana, Reinach era judío convertido al protestantismo, Scheller, de madre judía, convertido al catolicismo. Recordemos lo que dice Juan Martín Velasco en su introducción a la fenomenología de la religión. Él dice que sin el misterio no habría religión, pero para que haya religión no basta la presencia del misterio. Esta, en efecto, actúa en el interior de todo lo que existe y en el corazón de todas las personas. Pero no todas las personas son religiosas. Para que surja la religión es necesaria una determinada forma de respuesta, porque a esa presencia puede reaccionar el ser humano con la triple respuesta, la de no prestarle oídos, no prestarle atención de las muchas formas y por las múltiples razones que originan la indiferencia religiosa, y el sujeto puede responder con las dos formas positivas de increencia, que consiste en no querer desesperadamente ser sí mismo o querer desesperadamente ser sí mismo. La religión, dice Juan Martín Velasco, existe cuando la respuesta del hombre está a la altura de esa presencia y de su llamada. Pero también dice Velasco que las respuestas suelen ser polifacéticas porque el homo religiosus, que se ve afectado por las vivencias religiosas, no responde siempre de la misma manera, sino que cada hombre responde de manera distinta. De acuerdo con el pasaje anterior, hay religión cuando hay respuesta. Y dice el autor, la respuesta del sujeto religioso es polifacética porque afectado en su ser mismo, el hombre responde con todas sus facultades, con todas las facetas que hacen de él un ser humano y desde todos los niveles que comporta, el espiritual, el anímico, el corporal, mundano. Perdón. Hay un pasaje en Causalidad Psíquica que Edith Stein describe y uno podría preguntarse si se trata de una vivencia personal, cuando dice, me propongo, por ejemplo, emprender un viaje el próximo año, trasladarme a otra ciudad, terminar un trabajo comenzado, etcétera, y oriento enteramente mi vida actual con miras a ciertos planes para el futuro, pero en el fondo estoy totalmente convencido de que habrá algún acontecimiento que deshará todos mis planes. A esta creencia viva y genuina le niego mi asentimiento y no le permito que sea capaz en mí. En efecto, Juan Martín Velasco tiene razón al señalar que la religión existe cuando la respuesta del hombre está a la altura de la presencia de su llamada. Ello, como vamos a ver, apunta a la apertura de la persona, precisamente. Lo relevante de la vivencia religiosa es que, aun en aquellos casos en los que la persona se cierra y no responde a ese llamado, aún así, la vivencia religiosa sigue siendo lo que es, y lo que es dado y sentido en ella no desaparece. Así como el sujeto no pone la vivencia a través de un acto de la voluntad, sino que se deja interpelar por ella y la padece y es afectado, del mismo modo puede decirse que este sujeto tampoco puede borrar el contenido de la vivencia religiosa. No puede haber entonces religión si no hay respuesta, pero la ausencia de respuesta no cancela la validez de la vivencia religiosa. En su estudio sobre causalidad psíquica, escribe Stein esta experiencia precisamente de el estado de reposo en Dios y del estado de cobijo y de completa relajación, de lo que ella llama el descansar en Dios. En las siguientes palabras, existe un estado de reposo en Dios, de completa relajación de toda actividad espiritual, en la que no se hace ninguna clase de planes y menos aún se actúa, sino que todo lo futuro se deposita en manos de la voluntad divina. Uno se abandona por completo al destino. Este estado se me concede, por ejemplo, cuando una vivencia que sobrepasa mis energías ha consumido por completo mi energía vital espiritual y me ha arrebatado toda actividad. El descansar en Dios frente al fracaso de toda actividad por carencia de energía vital es algo completamente nuevo y singularísimo. Dentro de los aspectos que se puede destacar entonces de esta experiencia, nos encontramos con que el estado de reposo en Dios se deposita en manos de Dios, precisamente. En segundo lugar, lo que tenemos es que la voluntad de la persona se une con la voluntad de Dios, de modo tal que se acepta el destino y se confía en el plan divino. En tercer lugar, se da esta experiencia en la forma de una fuente de vida espiritual que imprime a la vida nuevas fuerzas para continuar con el trabajo diario y para seguir adelante. Además, que el problema de la fe sea mencionado siempre en conexión con algún estado de agotamiento ocasionado por algún golpe del destino sufrido por ella es algo que llama profundamente la atención. Y que las energías recibidas en la vivencia religiosa no son mías, por ende son ajenas, y el sujeto participa de una fuente de energía que no es propiamente suya. Además, que esta energía actúa en la persona sin imponer exigencias a las energías propias. El individuo, el sujeto de la vivencia religiosa, tiene un margen de libertad sobre el cual puede disponer y actuar. Y además, por último, podríamos señalar que en esta vivencia se muestra la capacidad receptiva de la persona a un determinado mundo de valores. En consecuencia, tanto para Stein como por Reinach, a Reinach no lo estamos exponiendo aquí propiamente, pero la vivencia de Dios como reposo y cobijo, que es una vivencia anímica que muestra la presencia de Dios, hace manifiesto tanto la esencia como la existencia de Dios, porque de este sentimiento de seguridad y del estar en manos de Dios habla Stein también en la introducción a la filosofía. En este pasaje que voy a presentar ahora, describe la situación de corte existencial en la que nos encontramos en una situación desesperada, cuando ya no es posible ver con el entendimiento y además cuando no se puede confiar en una persona para que nos ayude o nos socorra. La razón de ello es que en el mundo cualquier persona podría fallarnos. Por más que confiemos en alguien, ese alguien puede traicionarnos y darnos la espalda quizás cuando más lo necesitamos, cosa que no ocurre con Dios. En el saberse y sentirse en manos de Dios no se da esta inseguridad o esta angustia. Y entonces dice Stein en este pasaje, en ese sentimiento de seguridad nos percatamos de la existencia de un poder espiritual que ninguna experiencia externa nos enseña. No sabemos qué va a ser de nosotros. Ante nosotros parece abrirse un abismo y la vida nos arrastra inexorablemente hacia adelante, porque la vida sigue y no tolera ningún paso atrás. Pero cuando creemos que vamos a precipitarnos en el abismo, entonces nos sentimos en manos de Dios, que nos sostiene y no nos deja caer. El estar en manos de Dios, que Stein describe como un sentimiento y no como un acto, digamos, de la inteligencia o de la voluntad, se trata precisamente de una vivencia que se experimenta desde el alma. Se trata de una experiencia interior que toca el centro de la persona, esto es, su alma o su corazón. Es cierto que en esta obra Stein no habla del corazón como sede de la vida afectiva y centro de la existencia humana, pero de ello hablará precisamente en Aufbau der menschlichen Person, Potenz und Akt, en Liches und Sein, y ahí va a dar un lugar especial precisamente al corazón, a la interioridad. Cabe decir que Stein describe el estado de seguridad y el estar sostenidos en la mano de Dios a partir de la energía o fuerza vital que llena a la persona y que ella reconoce como una energía que viene precisamente de otro. Así lo describe en Causalidad Psíquica y así parece o aparece una vez más en su introducción a la filosofía. Pero hay aquí además la tesis según la cual este sentimiento de seguridad se revela tanto la existencia como la esencia misma de Dios. Y hay un pasaje en la introducción a la filosofía que dice, y en tal experiencia no solo se nos revela la existencia de Dios, sino que también se revela lo que Él es, su esencia. Se hace visible en las últimas irradiaciones la energía que nos apoya cuando fallan todas las energías humanas, que nos regala nueva vida cuando pensamos que estamos muertos internamente, que fortalece nuestra voluntad cuando ésta amenaza paralizarse. Esa energía pertenece a un ser todopoderoso. La confianza que nos hace admitir que nuestra vida tiene un sentido, aunque el entendimiento humano no sea capaz de descifrarlo, nos hace conocer la sabiduría divina. Y la confianza en que ese sentido es un sentido de salvación y en que, aún lo más grave, se halla finalmente al servicio de la salvación. Y en que además ese ser supremo se apiada de nosotros cuando los hombres nos abandonan y en que ese ser no conoce en absoluto ninguna depravación. Todo eso nos muestra cuál es su bondad total. Hay que subrayar, además de lo expuesto, lo relevante que resulta en este pasaje que el sentimiento de confianza aparezca con un sentido de salvación. De acuerdo con Juan Martín Velasco, el hombre religioso, en su relación con lo divino, busca salvarse. Dios se revela, de acuerdo con el texto de Stein, como bondad total, podríamos decir también, como sumo bien, pues no hay bien más alto que Dios mismo. En comparación con este bien, todos los demás bienes aparecen de manera inadecuada. Con el bien supremo, sostiene Velasco, aparece el valor que vale por sí mismo y que con su valor confiere sentido y valor definitivo a la existencia humana. La vivencia religiosa aparece como fuente de sentido de la existencia. Siguiendo a Gerard van der Leeuw, Velasco dice que la salvación es el objeto o el término de la actitud religiosa, en cuanto de él se espera y se obtiene la plena perfección que resumimos en el concepto de bien. Por su parte, Beate Beckmann-Seller dice que la experiencia de cobijo, de seguridad y de confianza, las cuales tienen un sentido absoluto de salvación, apuntan al cumplimiento de esos sentimientos merced a un poder que es perceptible como superior. Este poder superior del que da cuenta la vivencia religiosa es interpelado por Stein como un ser todopoderoso y sumamente bueno. Si bien Stein llega a decir que la conciencia religiosa no es el tema de su trabajo, y lo dice expresamente en su introducción a la filosofía, aún así ella se detiene en estas descripciones para indicar la validez de las vivencias religiosas y para indicar que la descripción de esta validez sería el trabajo de una filosofía de la religión. Y dice: la hemos aducido únicamente para mostrar que hay vivencias que reivindican el derecho de tener validez como experiencias y en las que un ser espiritual, su existencia y su esencia, llegan a ser el dato sin la ayuda de ninguna manifestación externa. Ahora, no es precisamente que Stein niegue la validez de los argumentos que se apoyan en la experiencia externa para probar la existencia de Dios, pero puede decirse que en esta línea está más cerca al planteamiento de San Agustín al seguir la vía de la interioridad. Este no es el lugar para hablar de la influencia de San Agustín en Stein, pero hay que tener en cuenta que dicha influencia la hay y que uno de los lugares donde se deja ver es justamente en el tratamiento de la vida interior de la persona, en la afectividad y en el corazón. Pero, ¿por qué el alma ocupa un lugar tan importante para la comprensión de las vivencias religiosas? Porque del mismo modo como lo hará von Hildebrand en su estudio sobre el corazón al hablar de los centros espirituales de la persona, Stein sostiene que el intelecto y la voluntad están más alejados del centro de la persona. Este centro de la persona, Stein lo llama alma, mundo interior o corazón. Es en este centro interior donde las vivencias religiosas aparecen y por ello tienen el sentido de vivencias afectivas. En ellas el sujeto se ve afectado. Por esta razón se habla de las vivencias en el sentido de un sentimiento. En su estudio Caminos para el conocimiento de Dios, que es un estudio sobre la teología negativa de Pseudo Dionisio Areopagita, Stein habla de ese sentimiento en el que Dios está presente y en el que uno se siente tocado en lo más íntimo por Él. Por otro lado, no debe olvidarse la influencia o recepción que se hizo de la fenomenología, de la obra de Schleiermacher por parte de los fenomenólogos, quien, oponiéndose al racionalismo, apostó precisamente por el sentimiento para la comprensión del hecho religioso desde una perspectiva hermenéutica. En el carácter antropológico de la teología, al hablar de la experiencia religiosa, David Pailin distingue entre varias formas de experiencia religiosa. Una de ellas se refiere al sentimiento, como queda descrito en la obra de Schleiermacher, donde describe la religión como el sentimiento de que todo ser y viviente es un ser y viviente en Dios y por Dios. Así, distinguirá la religión como el sentimiento de absoluta dependencia que acompaña toda nuestra existencia. Se trata de un sentimiento con carácter cognoscitivo, no solo al hacer que los individuos se den cuenta de su dependencia, sino también al hacer que tengan conciencia de aquello de lo que dependen. Por su parte, Juan Martín Velasco reconoce la influencia de Schleiermacher en los fenomenólogos clásicos de la religión a partir de los desarrollos de la irreductibilidad de la religión, en su subrayado de la experiencia religiosa como sentimiento y pasión por el infinito, y en su caracterización de la misma como sentimiento de dependencia absoluta. Velasco reconoce esta influencia de la tradición hermenéutica de Schleiermacher en los siguientes puntos. Primero, al reconocer la religión como campo específico e irreductible, especie de provincia especial del alma humana. Segundo, al definir la religión como sentimiento y gusto del infinito. En este caso se trata de un sentimiento que tiene un alcance cognoscitivo y hace referencia a la absoluta dependencia en relación con el infinito como contenido de ese sentimiento. Por último, el momento central de la religión es la experiencia, la vivencia en sentido fenomenológico, porque se trata de una vivencia de sentimiento. Lo relevante del trabajo de Schleiermacher entonces para la fenomenología es su convicción de que la religión es un dominio específico de la conciencia y de que, por tanto, no puede ser comprendida más que por sí misma, y a la insistencia sobre la importancia que posee en ella el sentimiento. Es verdad que estos temas hacen eco en la obra de Rudolf Otto sobre lo santo, pero no menos cierto es precisamente que esto aparece también en Adolf Reinach y en Edith Stein. Hasta donde sabemos, durante el año de 1918, Edith Stein estuvo ocupada trabajando en la filosofía de la religión. Este año es decisivo porque Reinach había muerto en noviembre de 1917 y porque alrededor de Semana Santa de 1918, Stein asistió al bautismo de Pauline Reinach. Además, en ese mismo año Stein había estado preparando una edición póstuma de los escritos de Reinach y había leído sus apuntes sobre filosofía de la religión. Sabemos además que en su cumpleaños Stein se regaló los sermones de Schleiermacher y que, como parte de su búsqueda de comprensión del fenómeno religioso, leyó La ejercitación del cristianismo de Kierkegaard, Los misterios del cristianismo de Scheven, Los ejercicios espirituales de San Ignacio de Loyola y Las confesiones de San Agustín. Respecto de la filosofía de la religión, entonces Stein da un lugar especial a la interioridad porque es el lugar donde el sujeto siente esta confianza y seguridad que le da Dios. Digamos también que es la vivencia religiosa de la persona, donde la persona es tocada desde dentro, desde lo profundo de su ser. Siguiendo entonces el método fenomenológico, lo que Edith Stein pretende es precisamente validar la experiencia religiosa como fuente de conocimiento.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias, Rubén. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
There are, of course, now multiple questions to you, and Eduardo, for example, has asked you then to answer his question, which is kind of complex, a little bit later. I just want to thank you very much for that, because you have shown up so many interesting kind of reasons which come to Edith Stein and so on. Especially thank you for mentioning not only Pauline, but also Adolf Reinach with his religious, with his thoughts on philosophy of religion, which he published 1960, 1970. So it was interesting to hear all these manifold aspects which you amazingly have showed. And if we compare what she wrote later on in 31 to Algunes Jägerschmidt, when Stein writes, it's only a small, short truth I have to tell. it's amazing how manifold this truth unfolds in her life. There's one question I would like to put to you, which has been asked to me some weeks ago, and it puts us back exactly 100 years. And I asked this as a kind of Anglican, so between Protestant and Catholic, which, because you mentioned also Protestantism. Konrad Martius and Stein go visit a church, go to a service in Bergzabern, and when they come out, it's about which way they would take. And Stein answers, heaven is closed in Protestantism and open in Catholicism. What do you make, given your experience of her religious experience, what do you make of such an expression that heaven is closed in Protestantism and open in Catholicism?
Thank you very, very much for your questions. It is a difficult subject. What I think is this, according to the indications of Edith Stein, religious experience can appear in oneself in the way of original experience, live in fifth person, or they can occur in others, and one emphasis with them. The phenomenon of empathy is very important for the religious experience.
Yes.
Because the other, in the other appears this experience. No, it is possible, though, methodologically, with this experience, but say Stein, not really. Why can you really do it? What happens here is that just a religious experience escaped the control of the will. That is, it is not an act of will, because the subject does not produce, but rather the experience and is affected by it. In the same way, the subject of religious experience does not eliminate or erase religious experience as such, and its content when he doubts what has been shown to him.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for this, Rubén. And I think there are some more questions coming in. I would just ask participants to save them and send them afterwards directly to Rubén. So thank you very much.
Many
and
thanks.
We'll looking forward to hearing you again. And now we are coming from the so-called Rome of Mexico to the real Rome in Italy. Thank you for waiting, Professor Ales Bello, for this time. It's a really big honor to present you at a conference, and a great privilege to listen to your contribution. To say anything about you, I would limit myself just to saying that you have facilitated abundantly for a comprehensive view on Edith Stein, and have been an amazing inspiration to so many of us, especially in Italy, Germany, and Brazil. Among the immense work for her, I'd like to highlight the Italian translation of Stein's works. Allora mi fermo qui, cara professoressa, e do la parola a lei. Prego.
Grazie, thank you. Please don't mind, it's all right. I am very glad to be here and to take part in this great conference in which we celebrate Edith Stein. Many thanks for having organized it, and I listened to the two presentations, and I am really, and to some extent, I agree with them totally. My paper, the title of my paper is how I arrive at the santliness. I is Edith Stein, sure. And I divided my paper in two parts. The first one is an introduction in English, and the second one is the development of Edith Stein's spiritual life. And because Italian is one of the official languages of this conference, I speak in Italian just to show that we have reflected very much on Edith Stein's figure and thought in our language, and we have translated all her philosophical works in 10 years at the end of the last century, and we are revising all the translations now just to complete the 28 volumes in Italian. And we are a great group, as you know. Professor Feldes knows us. And in this case, I should like to put myself on the path of my last book. My last book was published last spring, and the title is Assonances and Dissonances from the Diary of Edith Stein, which I wrote during the lockdown in 2020 on occasion of the pandemic. And in this book, I imagine that I discovered a diary in which Edith Stein tells her human, philosophical, and religious life. And while reading it, I wrote at the same time my impressions on my own diary. So that in this way, the two diaries are intertwisted. I hope that my book reached Professor Feldes. I don't know if you got it, but in any case, I sent it to you.
Grazie mille.
In this book, this time, I should like to continue. And I try to imagine that Edith Stein, what Edith Stein wishes to tell us regarding what she called her vita beata now, that is eternal life, and we call it santliness. The challenge in this case is to let her speak not in the dimension of time, as I suppose that she did in her diary, but in the condition of the eternal life. So that time and eternity are in this case intertwisted too, interlaced too. And I think that this operation is possible because we are in time, sure, but also in eternity. That is in us, as we have heard, listened to this, the previous presentation, that in us we have a nucleus, the soul of the soul, in which God is present. So we are both in time and out of time, that is in eternity. So it is possible to us, to some extent, to imagine what she would say to us as a saint, and how a saint can describe what happened in his or her worldly life. In this case, Edith Stein wants to show us how we could arrive at santliness. We could arrive at santliness as she arrived. So she will describe the development of her innerlichkeit, interiority, as far as the acceptance of faith. Or better, we know that she translated the German word Glaube, with the Fides, as she wrote in her first long essay on religious experience. The title is Freiheit und Gnade, or Freedom and Grace. I suppose that she starts from her psychic and spiritual situation in 1918. I defined this period de perturbazione animi, that is, perturbation of the soul. She was in search of the peace of her soul and could not find it in what she was doing. But her philosophical research is not separated from her interior development. She was writing Psyche and Causality and Individuum and Community. The first allowed her to understand what was happening in her own psyche. The second deepens her interest for communities, family community, friends communities, student communities, and state communities, and so on. But what was very important to her from an intellectual point of view was the encounter with Reinach's work on religion. There started, according to me, her conviction that the religious experience is not quite apart from a possible philosophical reflection on it. And it was very important for her because she would not do without philosophy. The philosophical approach pertained to her personality. I suppose that she would describe to us the main events of her life, which are meaningful for the way in which she improved her spiritual life. Providential encounters with other people, to which corresponds her philosophical analysis. Her main works in this sense are Freedom and Grace, as we are her secret writing, as she defined it. The Auseinandersetzung between Husserl and St. Thomas, the elaboration of the Christian philosophy in finite being and eternal being, and her work in mysticism. She was proclaimed saint because of her martyrdom, but also her virtues were examined. First of all, this theological virtues. Faith. The first one is faith, that is fides. And the description of faith is very, very important and unique according to me. She said that faith is a unique act and it is composed, but in any case, is composed with knowing, loving, and entrusting. And entrusting was for her the most important aspect of a fides. The exercise of charity is also necessary to be proclaimed a saint. And the most important sign of her charity was that she offered herself for her people, Jewish people. The third virtue is hope. According to her, hope is linked up with the cross. We know that she wrote an essay and the title was Ave Crux Unique Hope. She accepted her cross, offering herself. Describing her existence, so starting from the eternal point of view, she gives us an example that we can follow in our life. She remains for us a great teacher, even in this situation. Then I go to Italian just to pinpoint some aspects. I gave just a summary. E però voglio parlare, come dicevo, che voglio parlare italiano appunto perché noi stiamo lavorando tanto nella lingua italiana che mi sembra molto importante e sono molto grata agli organizzatori di questo convegno che mi permettono anche, mi dispiace per coloro che non capiscono, ma penso che la piccola introduzione che ho fatto possa essere sufficiente per avere un'idea. Naturalmente io devo scrivere un testo facendo parlare Edith Stein, quindi questo sarà un compito che mi assumo. E come dicevo, questo compito può essere sviluppato proprio perché questa duplicità di vivere nel tempo e nell'eternità, come già diceva Sant'Agostino, è molto importante per l'essere umano, altrimenti l'essere umano non potrebbe mai cogliere il divino se non avesse una traccia del divino in se stesso. Allora, audacemente noi possiamo metterci, per quanto è possibile, naturalmente nei nostri limiti, dal punto di vista dell'eternità e continuare appunto quel discorso che facevo nel mio libro Assonanze e Dissonanze, in cui ho immaginato l'esistenza di un diario, naturalmente tratto dalle opere della Stein e soprattutto dall'epistolario, che ci racconta la sua vita e ci racconta anche le sue, lo sviluppo intellettuale e spirituale della sua vita. Ecco, e io direi che la Stein, dal punto di vista dell'eternità, ci parlerebbe degli avvenimenti del 1918, cioè la visita ad Anna Reinach in occasione della morte del marito, l'aiuto a Husserl quando è stato malato, proprio in occasione di una pandemia che era la spagnola, secondo me, perché era il 1918 appunto. E ci parlerebbe del suo impegno politico, della sua delusione, del suo lavoro a favore delle donne, dei suoi rapporti con gli amici, in particolare con Ingarden. Ma perché ci parlerebbe di questo? Perché la santità si costruisce nel mondo. E la cosa interessante, lei non era ancora arrivata a quella che io dico la ripresa di un'esperienza religiosa più che una conversione. Io la definisco come una ripresa dell'esperienza religiosa giovanile che aveva abbandonato nell'ebraismo. E questa ripresa le consente appunto di comprendere meglio naturalmente quello che stava facendo, però anche prima di questa ripresa la sua personalità è straordinariamente orientata verso il bene. Ricordiamo per esempio la sua partecipazione come crocerossina, questa offerta anche di sé. Lei è una persona straordinariamente orientata verso il bene, ma si rende conto che c'è qualcosa di più, cioè che questo bene deve essere giustificato. E andrei ad un altro punto che lei ci indicherebbe, il 1921, quando scrive «Ho iniziato una trattazione sulla filosofia della religione». Allora, seguendo Reinach, lei comprende che l'esperienza religiosa è una cosa importante. È una cosa importante e deve essere ripresa, riesaminata, compresa. E questo è il suo scritto segreto, come sappiamo. E allora questo è il periodo che io definisco il periodo del de fide, dell'affidamento. Ed è un periodo molto importante perché qui c'è la riflessione proprio in quell'opera sulla libertà e la grazia, no? Freedom, Freiheit und Gnade, che molto opportunamente Marielle Wolf ha mostrato, ci ha descritto e ci ha proposto naturalmente. Ecco, in quest'opera sono stata colpita dalla definizione del Glaube, che non è appunto, Stein fa una serie di proposte di definizione, e non è semplicemente una certezza, una convinzione, un'opinione, un credere ciecamente, cioè una doxa, ma la definisce fides proprio perché, come abbiamo visto, è l'insieme di questo conoscere, amare e afferrarsi. Addirittura lei parla di un ergreifen, cioè un afferrarsi, questo entrasting è un ergreifen, è un afferrarsi. E qui c'è una sorta di affidamento che mi sembra veramente molto, molto importante come l'inizio della via verso la santità. E dopo questo affidamento c'è una seconda fase che definisco della desapienza, cioè dello svelamento. Che cosa si svela? L'incontro con Tommaso, suggerito da Pshivara, naturalmente è con Tommaso d'Aquino, è fondamentale. È fondamentale perché riunisce l'aspetto fenomenologico e l'aspetto metafisico in uno sfondo, ecco, quello che interessa la Stein è questo sfondo del divino. Tutto è grazia, tutto è Dio, e quindi c'è questo sfondo del divino, ma questo sfondo del divino è anche una sfida, perché noi dobbiamo riflettere, comprenderlo, quindi anche le prove dell'esistenza di Dio dal punto di vista razionale, come ci diceva prima il primo relatore, no? Dal punto di vista razionale. E poi Tommaso è importante anche per una seconda cosa. Perché dico desapienza? Mi sembra particolarmente significativo quel testo, L'intelletto degli intellettuali, quel piccolo testo, che è anche autobiografico ed è anche rivolto alla situazione degli intellettuali del suo tempo. Maliziosamente posso pensare anche a Heidegger, cioè persone che vanno di moda semplicemente perché hanno una capacità intellettuale molto forte, non basta. Quello che è importante è la sapienza, e la sapienza è il porre l'intelletto a disposizione anche della dimensione religiosa, dell'esperienza religiosa e del divino. E quindi ecco lo svelamento. E questo svelamento la porta, naturalmente, già l'aveva portata, in un certo senso, a leggere la Bibbia, quindi a trovare le ragioni profonde di quella sua lotta per il femminista, noi potremmo dire, e l'antropologia duale. L'antropologia duale ha basi teologiche, fondamentalmente, e qui c'è tutta l'analisi delle Genesi. Ma a questo punto lei ci direbbe: io decido di andare nel Carmelo. Ma perché questa decisione di andare nel Carmelo? Penso, ma questa naturalmente è una mia ipotesi rispetto a quello che lei ci dice, che lei appunto continuerebbe: vado nel Carmelo per non avere distrazioni, per mettermi in contatto con il divino in modo diretto, tuttavia non per eliminare gli altri o eliminare il mondo, ma per portare il mondo e gli altri nel Carmelo. E noi sappiamo che nel suo epistolario si trovano tanti contatti con il mondo esterno, che non è eliminato, ma d'altra parte i grandi mistici non eliminano mai il mondo esterno. Non si sa se la Stein è veramente una mistica, ma in ogni caso, perché non ce lo dice semplicemente, ma in ogni caso segue la via naturalmente dei mistici. E qui nel Carmelo lei riflette proprio sulla filosofia cristiana, torna a Husserl Tommaso e riflette sulla filosofia cristiana. E io direi che una delle cose importanti di questa riflessione è il tema della Trinità, che mi sembra particolarmente significativo per raggiungere la santità, così come noi pensiamo. Naturalmente Dio decide sulla santità al di là delle nostre proposte, però per la Stein credo che sia molto importante. E mi sembra anche particolarmente significativo il fatto che lei abbia voluto, non lo dice così espressamente, dare delle prove della santità. Addirittura in Essere finito e Essere eterno si intravedono delle prove, ma cioè cerca di capire, questa è la filosofia cristiana, qual è il contenuto della rivelazione, e dice in fondo, se Dio ci ha creato prima due ma poi tanti, Dio non può essere solo, Dio deve essere trino, deve essere un noi che ha quindi una particolare noi, che ha una relazione dinamica, un'unità che ha una relazione dinamica interiore. E come si giustifica? E qui Santa Teresa d'Avila le viene in soccorso, quando ha avuto quella rivelazione privata, questa è la mistica, una rivelazione privata, quando Santa Teresa dice vidi le tre persone della Trinità chinarsi su di me. Ma perché? Per amore. Ma non è l'amore solo nei miei confronti, ma è l'amore che si trova in Dio. E se c'è amore, c'è chi ama, chiamato, e l'amore, cioè il Padre, il Figlio e lo Spirito. E questo mi sembra un punto estremamente importante di approfondimento spirituale che troviamo in Essere finito, Essere eterno. Ma noi sappiamo che per essere proclamati santi è necessario non solo il martirio, in questo caso Edith Stein è stata proclamata santa per il martirio. C'è un'altra possibilità di essere proclamati santi, l'offerta della propria vita, e in realtà lei l'aveva fatto. E c'è una terza possibilità per essere proclamati santi, che è l'esame delle virtù. E mi fermo appunto, come ho già indicato, sulle virtù teologali, perché naturalmente si potrebbero esaminare anche le virtù cardinali e gli altri atteggiamenti che la Stein ha avuto. I consigli evangelici si chiamano, in che modo ha seguito i consigli evangelici. E io parlo di questo perché faccio parte della Commissione delle Cause dei Santi e quindi so qual è l'iter. Non ripeto quello che hanno detto storicamente riguardo alla Stein, ma voglio che la Stein stessa ci dica rispetto alle tre virtù teologali che cosa lei pensa e che cosa hanno pensato anche coloro che l'hanno proclamata santa. E la fede, abbiamo visto, la fede, questo atto unico ma complesso, questo affidamento, questa apertura verso l'eternità già presente nell'umano. E questo è l'elemento portante. E ancora, l'affidamento si trova in particolare proprio nel vado per il mio popolo, questa offerta di sé, legata appunto a questa fede. E questa offerta di sé legata alla fede è anche legata alla speranza. La speranza ha due dimensioni, una dimensione intramondana ed una extramondana. La speranza è il raggiungimento della vita beata, della vita eterna. E questo è anche un altro elemento importante per operare in funzione di questo raggiungimento. E poi la carità. La carità è il filo conduttore, secondo me, di tutta la sua vita. Al di là di alcune situazioni, di alcune sue... le dichiara questo anche nella storia della famiglia ebrea, anche in altri testi, dei suoi momenti difficili, diciamo. Ma lei si è sempre mostrata estremamente caritatevole nei confronti degli altri. E questa carità è appunto l'elemento che la contraddistingue rispetto alla comunità nella quale viveva. Sono molti gli episodi, ma non li possiamo raccontare. E allora, in questo racconto, la Stein si adegua a noi che siamo nel tempo, e come ha fatto Gesù con le parabole, proprio per dirci di esaminare la nostra vita, di vedere quali sono i punti fondamentali per poter raggiungere l'eternità e quindi la santità, perché non soltanto quelli che sono proclamati santi sono santi, ma Papa Francesco dice che ci sono i santi della porta accanto, cioè le persone che ci vivono vicino a noi, che raggiungono la vita beata anche se non sono proclamati santi. Ma noi siamo contenti che la Stein sia stata proclamata santa. Grazie.
Grazie mille. Grazie mille. Thank you very much, Professor Bello. È sempre un godere, un piacere di sentirla. Mi ha stupito specialmente queste fasi dell'affidamento e del svelamento. Allora mi sono ricordo, qualche anni fa abbiamo fatto un congresso nel confronto di Edith Stein e Alfred Delp. Era il titolo è stato Lotta e contemplazione. Lei ha fatto alcuni aspetti della lotta. How would you say it in Italian or in English? I don't care. How important was this aspect of fighting? Questo aspetto di lotta nella vita di Stein, quale importanza aveva?
Yes, I can say something in English, then perhaps
Sure.
Something in Italian. Fighting is very, very important. She was very, very strong. Her personality was really a strong one. And when she decided, she immediately, when she decided that something was good, this is the point, she immediately operated, worked to accomplish it, to realize it. So I think that fighting, and she was against her family. Her family was against her. We remember, and she went on because she knew that this was the truth, and she has to arrive at the truth. And she fought with the circumstances, but always to reach something good. And this is really, I think, very important. And even in contemplation, we find fighting, in the sense that the contemplation is something which we reach, or better, she reached, and struggling with perhaps with her psychic attitudes, and she described very well the limits of our psyche and the possibility of our spiritual forces, but all this requires a fighting, a struggle. This is very, very important. Very important. Thank you very much.
Most welcome. So, just a second. Yeah, some comments from Italian and from Argentina, which are just thankful for your contribution and actually also for your talk. Mi spiace molto che abbiamo sposto un po', ma non vedo l'ora per la prossima volta.
Please don't mind.
Va bene, allora ci vediamo la prossima volta, grazie mille. Un saluto cordiale a Roma. Va bene, okay. Now we turn to France and Germany at the same time. I may introduce and welcome Elodie Boublil. She is great having you with us, Elodie, and you are a lecturer in philosophy in the University of Paris, and from 2019 to 2020 she worked diligently on Edith Stein's works at the University of Cologne. Now, due to her special interest in phenomenology, ethics, empathy, and care, we are happy to have you here at the conference, where you are talking now on joy, interiority, and individuation on Edith Stein's. Elodie, you get our ears and minds. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I will start without further ado. I will share my screen. All right, so now you should be able to see it. Right. All right. So contemporary works in the phenomenology of emotions have recently paid specific attention to negative and hostile emotions. Indeed, drawing on Scheller or Husserl's analysis on empathy and their respective analysis of the structures and layers of affective life, current philosophical debates seem to revolve around the essence and understanding of pain, suffering, resentment, hate, trauma, existential despair, vulnerability, or contempt. In other philosophical traditions, such as virtue ethics, happiness studies flourish, quite independently from their negative counterparts. Some recent publications in continental philosophy offer also some phenomenological analysis of love in its relation to embodiment, notably through the philosophical analysis of erotic love, or some ethical understanding of it under the form of a revaluation of compassion and empathy. While for sure all these philosophical trajectories rightly portray the complexity of our affective life and human condition, I would like to investigate today Stein's analysis of joy to bring to light the richness, complexity, and systematicity of her analysis. I'd like to sketch out the way her reflection offers new perspectives altogether for philosophical anthropology, ethics, and metaphysics. However, apart from a specific section in Finite and Eternal Being, focusing on the definition of essence and using the concept of joy to engage in a discussion with Aquinas, Stein neither explicitly provided us with a theoretical analysis of joy as such, nor did she write another treatise of patience. Yet, throughout her collected works, joy serves as what I would call a pivotal concept. In French, that would be concept charnière, that helps her contrast her understanding of classical, phenomenological, or metaphysical notions, such as essence, empathy, intentionality, feeling, act feeling, core of the person, freedom, and Trinity. So contrasting these notions with their own innovative and personal philosophy of the human being. Indeed, we find occurrences and discussion involving joy, so either Freude or Heiterkeit, in almost all her writings. As an apparent sign of contradiction, a philosophy of the person, as well as her theology of the cross, reveals a quest for joy and fulfillment. This fulfillment does not rely on the self-centered sense of fullness that we may tentatively experience in the feeling of pleasure, but on the decentered yet genuinely individuated perspective one may have on life once heart revealed its depth and orientation. So I would like to argue that as a pivotal concept, joy helps Stein reframe existential and philosophical questions to elaborate first a refutation of nihilistic accounts, second, an overcoming of traditional phenomenological accounts, those of Husserl and Heidegger, and third, a spiritual appropriation of the experience of joy that has its own philosophical value and that seems different from classical and theological accounts of happiness. In this presentation, I'd like to sketch out the originality of Stein's analysis of joy as a legacy to contemporary philosophy and to the world, but more specifically, I'd like to focus on the relation between joy and interiority, and more specifically, the inner life of the self. I argue that our reflections on joy map out a new sense of interiority that bears anthropological, ontological, and ethical implications for a picture of personal individuation. By differentiating the various layers of our experience and understanding of joy, so joy as satisfaction, enjoyment, empathic joy, deep joy, rejoicing, divine joy, etc., Stein progressively unfolds an innovative conception of personhood and singularity, ultimately grounded in a renewed approach to philosophical anthropology and Trinitarian ontology. In the context of this presentation, I won't have time, obviously, to go over all these dimensions, but following our own past and philosophical interests, I will try to map out the main interconnection this pivotal concept of joy is drawing. So first, the specificity of Stein's phenomenological approach to joy regarding traditional accounts of happiness and the analysis of the passion of joy in classical philosophy. Second, reconsidering Husserl's legacy, the structure of joy and the specific type of intentionality that is at stake in the experience of joy in its relation to the ego constitution. Third, the genetic analysis of joy and its impact on the inner life of the subject and the constitution of the self. And I will end by concluding remarks that could be as well that developed in another presentation, in another conference, but the question of the analysis of the phenomenon of deep joy that I read as Stein's answer to Heidegger's analysis of anxiety. And last, the relation between deep joy in Interiority that portrays a new sense of individuation in its relation to desire and as a capacity for love. All right, so first, the relation between joy and happiness, some historical and context and definition. From Aristotelian ethics to contemporary hedonism, the human quest for happiness is a trait of our condition as well as a common thread of philosophy, spirituality, and religion. In this sense, as Adam Potsky explains in the opening lines of his book titled The Story of Joy, published in 2007, considerations on happiness and the analysis of positive emotions entail a reflection on the good life, and consequently a connection between ethics and philosophical anthropology. Joy is also often reduced to happiness or described as an emotional criterion to indicate that the righteousness of our decisions or the fact that we are actually on our way to happiness. In classical treatises, joy is considered as a positive passion, bringing about ethical behavior such as compassion, kindness, patience, and dedication. As Potsky summarizes, joy is a delight of the mind from the consideration of a present or approaching good. And while this good may just be one's own good, it generally involves beliefs about the good more generally. The discourse of joy thus involves in shifting and competing interpretations of human ends. The story of joy is in one light the history of the good pursued by effective means. The history of the good pursued by effective means. Nonetheless, happiness generally refers to the final state of being and living in the good, whereas joy implies a kind of lived intensity related to our inner experience and consciousness of time, as if joy was precisely breaking through our pre-reflective experience of time consciousness to offer us a glimpse of the authenticity and fullness of the living present. This sense of duration associated with joy has been studied, among others, by Spinoza. To him, joy reveals an increase in power and, as we know, a passage from less to a greater perfection. By Nietzsche, for whom joy expresses the freedom of the spirit, able to turn suffering into self-mastery. Or Bergson, who also relates joy to creativity and a living sense of achievement. According to these authors, the fundamental aspect of our experience of joy makes it a specific passion that reveals the desire and capacity for self-transformation lying at the core of the human being. In brief, one may say that reflecting on joy entails an ethical reflection, an anthropological reflection, and a metaphysical reflection on the human being in a relation to creation as a creator or as a creator or as her own relation to the creator. Moreover, genuine joy arises, which means that it is welcomed and received. In this sense, it entails a certain sense of alterity, joy for the other, before the other, with the other, or from another field or place within me, as we are going to see each time. So how does phenomenology deals with joy? Husserl's discussion of affective life takes place in dialogue with Brentano and descriptive psychology. His analysis of emotions, feelings, and moods is strongly connected with a reflection on their relations to values and volitions. In this context, Husserl will introduce further distinctions between joy, enjoyment, that is related to the feeling of pleasure and displeasure, and the subsequent denomination that will be attached as a value to the object which is experienced. What I perceive as enjoyable becomes simultaneously valuable. Sensory pleasure or displeasure is a primary sense state, whereas enjoyment is an intentional state. Emotions, therefore, imply a value judgment on the object itself that is presented and experienced. As Husserl writes in his recently published manuscripts on the structure of consciousness, I quote, "It is manifest that the joy about the beautiful, the relation that it elicits, is not joy about the mere being of the object, but joy about the being of the object of value." We will find also an extensive analysis of the relations between values and emotions in Scheler, of course. I don't have time to go over it in this presentation, but to summarize, one may say that phenomenological approaches to affective life revise our traditional analysis of human patience in light of the anthropology that is provided by phenomenological psychology. This new methodology consists in describing the various layers of affective life, sense, feeling, emotions, or moods, and the complexity of their relations with the other components of the human mind, cognition, and the will. Edith Stein will inherit such methodology as soon as her doctoral dissertation on empathy, and will carry it further in her works, as her analysis of joy in finite and eternal being will show. Stein uses joy as a pivotal concept to question the structure of intentional consciousness and the status of the transcendental ego. And this is why I term it a pivotal concept, because it does not only help describe these various layers of affective life by contrasting joy with sorrow, for instance, but it also unveils something about the structure of consciousness and the structure of the person. So throughout his text on affective life and phenomenological psychology, Husserl elaborates a typology of joy based on the intentional structure of consciousness and the modes of experience of joy. I'm following here Mariano Crespo's analysis that he laid out in a recent article dedicated to the concept of joy in Husserl, published in 2020. First, joy arises when the object of desire is realized, when desire is fulfilled. Joy is an intentional feeling that could be expressed in several ways. Second, joy could be defined as a reaction. It is the apprehension of a pleasant object that causes joy in the subject, so it comes from the outside. And third, joy could be grasped as a state of mind. One may remain joyful long after the original source or occasion of joy disappears. Edith Stein will remember that aspect of the Husserlian analysis while reflecting on empathy and memory. She explicitly uses joy in the problem of empathy. Yet, as we will see, our considerations on the vital force will considerably transform that conception. Based on these three basic characteristics, fulfillment, reaction, and let's say state of mind or coloration of the inner life, let me now turn to Stein's analysis. The way Stein puts into question Husserl analysis and the role of the transcendental ego in the unification of our inner life does shape and transform our approach to joy. If we rely on our discussion of joy in finite and eternal being, we notice first that she remains faithful in some ways to the Husserlian framework. Taking the example of the good news we have, she writes indeed, and that's the quote you have on the slide, we may say then that the experience of the content joy is conditioned in a twofold way, by the object and by the ego. The object, in our example, the content of the news, is not itself a part of joy as experiential content, whereas the tending towards that object is indeed a part of the experiential content. Phenomenology uses the term intention to designate this tending toward. The characteristic which makes this experience joy with respect to this particular object is a constitutive part of joy, and the same is true of the intentional object, i.e. the object toward which joy tends. The entire Erlebniseinheit, this particular joy, is closed or completed at the moment when I no longer experience this joy, or at the moment when I may again experience joy, but not with respect to the same object. In this analysis, we see that Stein defines joy as an intentional feeling, depending on the object's apprehension, the tending toward intentionality, and the value attached to it. Yet she takes a step forward by mentioning the case where I can recognize something or an event as objectively joyful based on my previous experience or moral understanding of it, but I cannot feel and experience that joy. In this case, she identifies a kind of resistance that she attributes to the self. I quote, "But what kind of a self or ego is it that we have in mind here? When I try to give an account of the reason why I'm not able to experience joy, I may discover that I am so engrossed by some profound grief that there is no room left for joy. Or I may simply find that I cannot experience joy without being able to name any specific reason. But I'm convinced, nonetheless, that the reason for not being able to experience joy lies in me, even if I find it impossible to track it down. I must conclude, therefore, that there are things hidden within me, all kinds of things, which are unknown to me. And in this sense, it may be said that the ego is not part of the experiential content. The ego transcends my experience, as does the object, in a similar and yet not identical manner. This is why Husserl applies the term transcendent to both the object and the psychological ego." End of quote. Two elements seem important here. First, a lack of self-transparency, a kind of opaqueness that prevents both self-mastery and self-creation. The subject cannot decide to be joyful in the genuine sense of the term, as we'll see later. Second, the subject encounters an emotional resistance that she cannot break by itself. Yet, since the ego transcends the experience, the subject is free to consent or not to the finitude and limitations of her affective experience. Joy appears here as a pivotal concept because it allows Stein to move from an Husserlian understanding of the transcendental ego to her own account of the person, loaded with what I would call a transcendental affectivity. Stein gives consistency and flesh to the transcendental ego in her account of the inner life of the subject, while redefining the sense of personal individuation and freedom in regard to the deeper layer of the soul unveiled by her analysis of joy. Several features could characterize the originality and legacy of Stein's analysis of joy. They all contribute to rethink interiority as a dynamic and individuating experience of dispossession and transformation. First, he engages in a discussion with Lebensphilosophy and vitalism through her concept of vital force, and thereby follows up on the metaphysical tradition that links up joy with desire and perfection. She is reconnecting the discussion on emotions with the discussion on the life force. One may say that she's building philosophical bridges here. Joy contributes to sustain the dynamics of personal and collective individuation, the flourishing of her personal notes. Joy feeds the vital force, whereas fear or hostile attitudes diminish its power. It's pretty clear in several passages. This one is from Potency and Act, about the specific content of the emotional movements. She speaks about a diverse into negative and positive feelings. And toward the end of the quotes, it's an important line when she explains that it increase or reduce one's own strengths, anger, grief, etc., eat away at the soul, enthusiasm, joy, increase their lives, etc. Our understanding of the vital force explains the intensity of the experience, but does not exhaust its reality and presence. She writes, joy, for example, which filled my heart a moment ago, but which is now fading away, can no longer be called fully alive, but neither is it entirely extinguished and forgotten as if it had never been real. It is still there, but as compared with its full vitality, it is in a weakened state of being. This is in varying degrees true of all that exists in the present, but is not fully alive. It is true of everything which at one time was, but no longer is fully alive, inasmuch as it can pass over again from its present mode of being into a state of full vitality. and it is true of everything that will be fully alive in the future, provided it once possessed that seminal mode of being in a preceding span of time. This living dimension and the precariousness or fragility of our experience of joy make her reflect on temporality, from the temporality of our inner experience to the finitude of our temporal being. And it's a certain sense of enduring that is revealed and manifested here. She builds on Husserl's analysis of time consciousness and the living present to assert the contemporaneity of our experiences and their intertwining within the living present. We are not moving on, we are moving through. As she explains, my existence is a continuous movement, a fleeting, and in the strictest sense, a transitory kind of being, and thus the extreme opposite of eternal and immutable being. The being of the ego is alive only from moment to moment. It cannot be quiescent because it is restlessly in flight. It thus never attains true self-possession. And we are therefore forced to conclude that the being of the ego, as a constantly changing living present, is not autonomous, but received being. It has been placed into existence and is sustained in existence from moment to moment. This, however, implies the possibility that this being may have a beginning and an end, and that it may suffer a break. End of quote. Consequently, authenticity and self-transformation do not arise solely from a decision of the will, but are occurring through this continuous movement provided, that provides a subject, and the subject is provided with, and that lets herself be guided by the deeper layer of the soul, the unfolding of the personal note. Moreover, Stein pays specific attention to the truthfulness of that experience. And even we talked about it a lot yesterday and today, but this dimension of truthfulness and authenticity in the experience of joy is very important to her. She really sees joy as a marker of individuation. She has several reflections and passages where she talks about actually some sort of fake joy. And it seems to me that the way she sees joy as that marker of individuation reveals the fact, or that intertwining that we were talking about earlier on, between the twofold dimension of the human being, this twofold belonging to time and eternity. Joy comes in also in her reflections and authenticity. The greater perfection brought about by true and deep joy has to do with its original modes of presentation. In several passages, she analyzes and questions that truthfulness, as I just said. She denounces, for instance, Schadenfreude, the fact of rejoicing in the other's pain and misfortune, but also fake joy, as I just said. And she often calls for, and that's one of her expressions, intellectual honesty in the way we look at our own emotions and feelings. So there is an interesting connection here between joy and truthfulness. And it makes me insist also on the fact that it's a quote from Finite and Eternal Being, when she said that no one can make me understand what joy is unless I myself have experienced joy. But once I have experienced joy, then I also understand what joy as such is. So to her, true and deep joy does not arise from a reactive attitude, like a reaction to something of someone, but from what I would call a receptive attitude. Deep joy precedes the subject in a way. The subject welcomes it, and joy radiates in and through all the layers of a person. True joy comes out of the inner life of the person, and it is first personally given. I was speaking of transcendental affectivity earlier on, while Stein talks about the transcendent depth of the ego from which joy arises. And I will briefly conclude. In this context, we can say that the reintroduction of the concept of the soul allows time to reframe the phenomenological categories and distinctions provided by Husserl into the body-soul-spirit schema inherited from Christian metaphysics. It allows her to introduce new layers endowed with ontological consistency. In this way, she reconciles, or as I am tempted to say, goes beyond to emphasize her contribution, but let's say reconciles Husserl's and Aquinas' understanding of affective life. In her discussion of Aquina's theory of joy in its relation to desire, love, and perfection, she uses joy to reflect on nature and essence, to ultimately claim, I quote her, that a pure and exhaustive experiential science of the psychic is simply impossible, end of quote. This discussion takes place within the general project of finite and eternal being that consists in a new understanding of the relation between the human being and her creator in a post-Husserlian and post-Heideggerian time. In the introduction, I mentioned Stein's Science of the Cross and the way, as a theologian and a martyr, her reflections are often dealing with suffering and sacrifice. In our discussion of Heidegger's concept of anxiety and its existential function in the life of Dasein, Stein shows us that anxiety, as understood by Heidegger, reveals our finitude in what I would call agnostic manner. Anxiety reveals to us our experience of being thrown in the world, resolutely condemned to death. I contend that the way she understands joy as the upsurging from that transcendent depth she talks about replaces anxiety in our own framework and helps takes the place of our anxiety in our own framework and helps her understand finitude and consequently individuation in a completely different way. So the anxiety, the role of anxiety in Heidegger framework as a new form of epoche is replaced by Stein's understanding of joy, and we can also take a step further and see here that conversion replaces the movement of the epoche. The paradoxical coincidence of self and alterity, activity and passivity within the subject reintegrates affective life, flesh and blood incarnation in our understanding of the person, while bringing to light the underlying dynamics that constantly gives her existence. In this sense, their final understanding of joy in its relation to suffering conveys also an ethical dimension thanks to a reading of St. John of the Cross. As Professor Ales Bello just explains, we are intimately at once in time and eternity. And consequently, the ethical and religious standpoints, her ethical and religious standpoints, sounds like her ultimate legacy to the world. The cross is not about suffering, it is about love. Thank you.
Most welcome. Thank you very much, Elodie. It was a really great talk. And I thank you very much for confronting these different concepts of joy to happiness and the difference between Stein's approach and Husserl's approach. And also very much I'm thankful for your distinguishing of Stein's understanding of joy to Heidegger's approach on anxiety. There are multiple claims to make Edith Stein Doctor of the Catholic Church, and you know that. And teaching is so often about statements and so on. And now here is someone who teaches, who could lead us to a good way to approach joy, not naivety, but joy. Would you say that Stein's understanding and teaching of joy could be of help in a world of today?
Definitely, and I think that's also where I'm going in the conclusion. I just mentioned love, but of course it has like a strong relation to the other theological virtues, namely faith and hope, and a strong relation to hope too, especially through our understanding of joy in relation to time consciousness. It seems to her that we have these sort of glimpses into eternity through the experience of joy that actually help us endure a number of things, and that actually sustain our life experience. And the other things regarding, I would say, contemporary philosophical approaches and the legacy of Stein among all these approaches, and also what makes her account very original, is that there's a deep sense of incarnation in the way also she perceives joy. And so I think this is very important because she explicitly, thanks to the phenomenological method, distinguishes joy from satisfaction and pleasure, obviously, like she connected also with value as joy as an intentional feeling. And yet it remains really in sort of affective experience we're going through. So without being able really to have a grasp on it.
Okay, thank you very much. I already see that Eduardo has now posted the links for the next session, but there is a last question which I find really intriguing of Lauren Lovestone, and she writes, "You made it clear why you focused on joy, but have you thought about love? Especially you're ending inside about John of the Cross. In other words, what made you focus on joy instead of love? Also, since she talks about love as well, but my thinking based on your talks is that she just gives more very insight about joy versus love. What would you say about the balancing of joy and love in your
Definitely.
interview?
Well, I wish I had more time to talk about love, actually. So, but the way I see it is that the way she sort of reuses the concept of joy also provide us with a new account of interiority, or the way we relate to our inner self. And through this experience of joy, we are sort of reconnecting with the soul of the soul, with the core of the soul too, and with the source from which that joy comes from, and which is deeper sense of love. Okay. So joy would be a sense of participate. Joy would be a way to participate in that love, I would say.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Looking forward to hearing you again next time. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, all of you who have joined this session. I'm looking forward now to go on to another sessions. You have already received the links. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your question, your attention, and then see you in the next days or perhaps after the break. Thank you very much.
I copy the links in the chat, general chat. Sala 1 and Sala 2, both of them.
Yeah, they are all now online.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eduardo.
Father Joachim, Dankeschön.
No, welcome. It was an honor, it was a joy, had fun. See you then.